The moment Grant Hale rode into Caldwell, Kansas, on a sweltering July afternoon in 1878, he had no idea that by nightfall he would be handed a woman's future like a deed to unwanted land, and that by morning he would choose to tear that deed apart with his own two hands. He had been riding for 3 days straight, following the Kishom Trail north from Texas with 40 head of cattle and a soul worn thin as old leather. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kansas border like a man half asleep at his own table, its dusty main street lined with clapboard storefronts, a rail depot that smelled of coal smoke and grease, and a saloon called the Red Spur that never seemed to close its doors. Grant was not a man who sought out trouble. He was 28 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck from weeks of trail sweat, and eyes the color of river stone after rain, gray with flecks of green that caught the light when he smiled, which was not often enough. He drove cattle for an outfit out of San Antonio, a respectable operation run by a man named Clifton Bower, and when the drive ended, Grant intended to collect his wages, rest his horse, and head south again before the August heat turned the trail into a furnace. That was the plan. The trouble with plans in the West was that they had a way of dissolving the moment they touched real life. He was settling his horse, a big roan he called August, into the livery stable on the east end of town when he heard the voices. Not raised exactly, but tight, the way voices get when men are speaking about something they consider finished that has not quite been finished. Grant was good at reading silence and sound alike, a skill the trail had sharpened in him over years, and what he heard through the thin plank wall of the stable told him immediately that someone nearby was deeply unhappy. He led August into a stall, gave him water and a measure of oats from the livery keeper's barrel, paid the man a fair price for the night, and stepped back out into the dry afternoon air. Across the narrow side alley between the stable and the feed store next door, 3 men stood in a loose triangle, and in the middle of that triangle, though she was not quite surrounded, stood a young woman with her arms crossed over her chest, and her chin lifted at an angle that suggested she was holding back something far stronger than she was letting show. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with dark auburn hair pinned up but coming loose at the temples from the heat, wearing a plain calico dress of deep blue that had seen better days but was clean and pressed, and her eyes, when they caught the afternoon light, were a clear and striking hazel that shifted between green and gold. Grant noticed all of this in the time it took him to take 3 steps, which he would later find remarkable, that a man could take in so much in so little time. The man doing most of the talking was Rupert Gaines. Grant did not know his name yet, but he would learn it. Gaines was perhaps 50, thick through the middle, wearing a good suit that had grown too small for him in recent years, and a hat with a wide brim that did little to hide the flushed, self-satisfied look on his face. He had the manner of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted by saying the right words to the right men, and not accustomed at all to the experience of a woman telling him no. "Your father shook my hand, Miss Covington," Gaines was saying, his voice low and firm. "A man's handshake in this country is his bond. I have held up every part of the arrangement, and I expect you to hold up yours." The young woman, Miss Covington, let out a short breath that was not quite a laugh. "My father," she said, "shook your hand. I did not shake your hand. I was not consulted. I was informed the same way you inform a piece of furniture that it is being moved to a different room." Gaines' face darkened slightly. "You are being dramatic." "I am being accurate," she said. The 2 men flanking Gaines said nothing, but they stepped slightly inward, and Grant recognized the motion for what it was. He had seen that kind of subtle pressure applied before, the way a corral gate gets eased shut around a nervous animal, slow enough that the animal doesn't bolt until it's already too late. Grant stepped into the alley. He did not do it with any great plan in mind. He simply could not stand there and watch it happen any more than he could stand by and watch a man spur a horse that was already down. It was not in his nature, and he had stopped apologizing for his nature years ago. "Afternoon," he said, addressing the group in general, though his eyes went to the woman first just briefly to check whether she was all right. She was not all right, but she was holding herself together with both hands, which he respected. Gaines turned to look at him with the expression of a man who has been interrupted mid-sentence by a stranger. "This is a private matter," he said. "I can see that," Grant said pleasantly. He stopped walking about 6 feet from Gaines and hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Miss, are you all right?" She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts suspicion and desperate gratitude, a combination he found instantly arresting. "I am managing," she said carefully. "She is fine," Gaines said. "This does not concern you, friend." "I am not your friend," Grant said, and he said it without heat, the way you state a simple fact about the weather. "But I am curious about this arrangement you mentioned, if you don't mind me asking." He minded. That was plain. But the woman said quickly, before Gaines could shut the conversation down, "Mr. Gaines made an agreement with my father regarding me. I was not part of the making of that agreement." Grant looked at Gaines. "That's so?" Gaines squared himself up slightly. "Her father owes me a considerable sum. The arrangement was made in good faith and in full legal standing. The girl goes with me to my ranch outside of Dodge. She runs the household and the debt is cleared." "That is not marriage," Grant said quietly. "That is purchase." The word landed in the alley like a stone dropped in still water. The woman's eyes cut to him sharply, and something shifted in them. Some guard that had been up came fractionally down, because he had named the thing exactly. "This is none of your affair," Gaines said, and now the pleasantness in his own voice was gone entirely. "Maybe not," Grant said. "But I have a problem with watching a woman get handed off like livestock, and I find that problem difficult to ignore." One of the flanking men, the larger of the two, shifted his weight toward Grant, and Grant turned his eyes to that man slowly, unhurriedly, the way a man turns to look at something he is not particularly afraid of. The man, to his credit, read the look correctly and stopped moving. "What is your business in Caldwell?" Gaines asked. "I drove cattle up the trail," Grant said. "I am paid up and heading out tomorrow. My business is finished." "But yours," he said, "I think ought to be reconsidered." Gaines stared at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the woman, and the look he gave her made Grant's jaw tighten, because it was the look of a man cataloging something he considers his property. "This is not finished," Gaines said to her. Then he looked at Grant. "And you would do well to stay out of matters that have nothing to do with you." He turned and walked back toward the main street, his two men following. The sound of their boots on the dry ground faded. Grant turned to the woman. She was watching him with those hazel eyes, and up close he could see that she had been frightened, genuinely frightened, beneath the iron posture she had maintained. There was a slight tremor in her jaw that she was working hard to suppress, and her hands, now at her sides, were not entirely steady. "Are you all right?" he asked again, because the first time she had not truly answered. "I am better now," she said, and this time she meant it. "Thank you." She paused, studying him. "You did not have to do that." "No," he agreed. "Most men would not have," she said. "Most men," he said, "are not me." She almost smiled. It was the beginning of something. He did not know it yet, but it was. "I am Grant Hale," he said. "Dorothy Covington," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it, which was not the usual thing. Most men in that time tipped a hat and nothing more, but it felt right, and she seemed to appreciate it. "How much does your father owe this man?" Grant asked. Her expression dimmed. $400, a debt from a land deal that went badly last spring. My father took sick in April and has not recovered well. When he was low, Gaines came to visit, and my father, I think, was not entirely clear in his thinking when he agreed. She paused. "I should not tell you all of this. You are a stranger." "I am," Grant said. "But I am a stranger who has just watched your afternoon, and I think I have earned a little bit of the story." She looked at him steadily. "He will come back," she said. "He is not the kind of man who accepts being told no, and my father genuinely does owe him the money. I cannot simply make that go away by refusing." "Where is your father now?" "At home. We have a small place half a mile east of town. My father built it in '69 when we came out from Missouri." She hesitated. "Why are you asking?" Because, Grant said, I would like to talk to him. She tilted her head. You just said your business in Caldwell is finished. I thought it was, he said. Turns out I may have been wrong. She stared at him for another moment, clearly trying to determine what manner of man he was and what manner of motive he carried, and he did not look away because he had nothing to hide. Whatever he was it plainly. All right, she said finally. Come and meet my father. The Covington place was a modest homestead set back from the main road by a long lane of packed earth, bordered on either side by scrubby cottonwood trees that gave a little shade in the heat of the day. The house was small but well kept, a two-room structure with a covered porch and a kitchen garden running along the south side where Dorothy had planted tomatoes and squash and beans in neat rows. A windmill turned slowly in the afternoon breeze, and the well beneath it was the good, deep kind, which in that country was worth almost as much as the land itself. Her father, Ellis Covington, was on the porch when they arrived. He was 60 and looked older, a thin man with a gray beard and eyes that matched his daughter's in color if not in energy, for his were tired where hers were sharp. He had a blanket across his lap despite the heat, and his breathing when he spoke was slightly effortful, but his mind was clear enough, which was clear from the first moment he spoke. You are the man who helped my daughter in town, he said. He had apparently already received word, the way news traveled in small frontier communities with remarkable speed. Grant Hale, sir, Grant said, removing his hat. I would like to speak with you about Rupert Gaines if you are willing. Ellis Covington looked at him for a long moment, then at Dorothy, then back at Grant. Sit down, Mr. Hale, he said. Grant sat in the second porch chair and Dorothy leaned against the porch rail listening. Ellis said, I made a mistake, I know that now. I was not well and I was frightened, and Gaines had a way of presenting things that made the arrangement sound reasonable. He said Dorothy would be well provided for. He said the debt would be cleared. He paused. I did not think of it the way it truly was. I did not think of it the way you named it in the alley, apparently. Grant said nothing for a moment. Then he said, what would it take to clear the debt outright? With money instead? Ellis looked at him. $400, as Dorothy said. But Mr. Hale, I cannot ask you. You are not asking, Grant said. I am offering. There was silence on the porch. Dorothy had gone very still. Why, Ellis said. You do not know us. You rode in an hour ago. I drove cattle for 3 months, Grant said. I have my wages on me. I'm a single man with no property and no debt. The money is mine to use as I see fit, and this seems to me to be a worthy use of it. Dorothy said quietly, Mr. Hale. He looked at her. This is very generous, she said, and I am not going to refuse it because my pride is not worth more than my freedom. But I need you to understand that this does not create any obligation between us. I will not trade one arrangement for another. He held her gaze. Miss Covington, he said, I am not offering the money in exchange for anything. I am offering it because it is the right thing to do, and I am in a position to do it. That is the whole of it. She studied him for a long time, the way a person studies a horizon when they are not sure what the weather will bring. All right, she said. Grant rode back into Caldwell that evening with $400 in his coat pocket and found Rupert Gaines at the Red Spur Saloon, as he had expected. The saloon was full in the early evening, cowhands from various outfits, a few townsmen, a card game in the corner, the smell of tobacco smoke and whiskey and sawdust. Grant walked to where Gaines sat at the bar and set the money down in front of him. Gaines looked at the bills and then at Grant with slow, careful eyes. That is $400, Grant said. It is payment in full of the debt Ellis Covington owes you. I am asking you to acknowledge the debt cleared and to have nothing further to do with Miss Covington or her father. Gaines looked at the money for a long time. He was a man who understood money and the power of it, and $400 in hand was more certain than $400 represented by a sick old man's vague promise of a daughter's labor. Grant could see the calculation moving behind his eyes. Where did a cattle hand come by $400? Gaines asked. 3 months of honest work, Grant said. Do we have an agreement? Gaines picked up the money slowly. He counted it, which Grant had expected and which he did not rush. Then Gaines folded the bills and put them in his breast pocket and looked at Grant with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite respect, but was something in between the two. The debt is cleared, Gaines said. The Covingtons are no concern of mine. Good, Grant said. He turned to leave and Gaines said behind him, You must want something from that girl yourself. Grant stopped but did not turn around. No, he said. But I imagine it is difficult for you to understand an action that is not motivated by wanting something in return. I am sorry for that difficulty. He walked out of the red spur and into the blue dark of the July evening, and he felt lighter than he had in a long while, despite being $400 poorer. He rode back out to the Covington homestead because he felt he owed them the news, and also, if he was honest with himself, which he usually tried to be, because he wanted to see Dorothy again. He did not examine this impulse very closely in the ride out, but it was there, warm and persistent as an ember. Dorothy was on the porch alone. Her father had gone inside to sleep, she said. She had a lamp lit beside her chair and was mending something, a piece of fabric that caught the soft yellow light. She looked up when she heard August's hooves on the lane and set the mending aside. Is it done? She asked. It is done, he said. He took the money. He acknowledged the debt cleared. She let out a breath that she had been holding for what sounded like a very long time. Thank you, she said, and the words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. He dismounted and tied August to the porch rail, because he did not intend to stay long, or at least that was what he told himself. He sat in the porch chair again, and she offered him water from the pitcher she kept out, and they sat in the warm evening air while the cottonwoods moved gently in the night breeze and the stars came out over the wide Kansas sky, the kind of sky that only exists on the open plains, vast and clear and full of impossible light. Where are you from originally? She asked. They had both understood without saying so that they were going to talk for a while. Virginia, he said. My family had a farm in the Shenandoah Valley. The war took it, more or less. My father passed in '66, and there was not much to hold me there. I came west in '69 when I was 19. She was quiet for a moment. I am sorry about the farm, she said, and your father. It was a long time ago, he said. What about you? You said you came from Missouri. St. Joseph, she said. My mother passed when I was 15. My father brought us out here in '69, same year you came west, which is funny. She paused. He wanted to start fresh. He has always been a man who believed in fresh starts. That is a good way to be, Grant said. It is, she agreed, as long as you are also careful. She glanced at him sideways. He was not always careful. They talked for what turned out to be 2 hours, which surprised Grant when he finally looked up at the moon's position and realized the time. They talked about the territory, about the cattle trade, about what Kansas had been when the buffalo herds had still moved through, and what it was becoming now. Something different, not necessarily better, just different. She was educated in the way that frontier women sometimes were, not formally but broadly. Her father had kept books and she had read all of them. And she had opinions and she shared them plainly, without the apologetic hedging that some women in that era were trained into. Grant found himself leaning forward in his chair without realizing it, the way you lean toward a fire in the cold. When he finally rose to go, she stood as well, and they were closer together in the lamplight than they had been all evening, the porch being narrow, and he was very aware of this proximity in a way that was difficult to attribute to anything other than the simple truth of it. You will head south tomorrow, she asked. That was the plan, he said. Was, she noted. Is, he corrected himself, though the word felt less certain in his mouth than it had that morning. Mr. Hale, she said. Grant, he waited. I would like to see you again, she said. She said it levelly, without embarrassment. The way she said most things, which he was already coming to understand, was simply how she moved through the world. If you are passing through again, or if your plans change. My plans have a way of changing, he said. "I have noticed that about you," she said. And this time she did smile, fully, and the effect of it in the lamplight was something he was not prepared for, a warmth that moved through him from his chest outward, and he stood there for a moment like a man who has stepped into sunlight after a long time in shadow. He rode back to town with his chest full of something he did not yet have a name for, and August seemed to sense his rider's distraction and moved steadily and carefully, as good horses do when their riders are not entirely present. He did not leave the next morning. He told himself it was because August needed another day of rest. This was true. He also told himself it was because he wanted to make sure Gaines did not come back around to cause trouble. This was also true. He did not tell himself the other true thing until later, which was that leaving felt wrong in a way that was new to him, a gravitational resistance he had not encountered before. He spent the day making himself useful in ways he had not been asked to. He repaired a section of fence along the Covington property that had a post rotted through at the base, replacing it with a good cedar post from the lumber yard in town, paying for it himself. He checked the windmill mechanism and found that one of the connecting rods had worn thin and needed replacing, which he could not fix alone, but which he reported to Ellis with a specific recommendation for the blacksmith in town who could make the part. Ellis received all of this with a kind of quiet gratitude that had nothing showy about it, just a steady warmth, which Grant respected. Dorothy brought him lunch on the porch while he worked in the afternoon heat, cornbread and cold beans and a glass of buttermilk, which was exactly what his body needed after hours in the July sun, and she sat with him while he ate and they talked again, this time about lighter things, about a ridiculous incident from the cattle drive involving a particularly stubborn longhorn steer that had developed an inexplicable aversion to crossing a specific creek, and she laughed at the story, a real laugh. Unguarded, and the sound of it did something irreversible to his internal landscape. He stayed another day, and then another. By the fourth day, Caldwell had begun to notice Grant Hale. A single man who had been paid off from a cattle drive and had not left was an unusual thing. Men generally either drank their wages at the Red Spur or rode back south. Grant did neither. He paid for a room at the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Callahan, ate his meals there, and spent most of his days out at the Covington place or in town gathering materials and doing whatever work needed doing. People talked, because people always talked in small frontier towns, where everyone's business was everyone else's primary entertainment. Grant paid the talk no mind, and Dorothy, when she heard of it, seemed equally unmoved, which he admired. One evening, a week after his arrival, they walked along the edge of the property as the sun went down, following the line of a small creek that ran along the eastern boundary and had enough water in it, even in July, to keep a narrow strip of grass green. The cottonwoods along the bank were larger here, older, and they gave good shade, and the sound of their leaves in the breeze was the kind of quiet music that the open country made if you listened for it. Dorothy had brought a shawl against the evening cooling, and she wore it loosely, and she walked beside him with a natural ease that he noticed, because it contrasted with the tension he had seen in her that first afternoon in the alley. She was comfortable with him now and he with her, and the fact of this, that comfort had arrived so quickly between two strangers, was something he turned over in his mind with something close to wonder. "Tell me something true about yourself," she said. They had been walking in comfortable silence. "I am afraid of horses," he said. She looked at him. "I am not," he said. "I simply said the first thing that came to mind. Let me try again." She waited. "I do not know what I want," he said. "I mean, I have known what I was doing, which is cattle and trail work, but I have not known what I wanted, what the point of it was. I have been moving for 9 years, which is a long time to be moving without a destination." She was quiet for a moment. "And now, he said, "I think I may have an idea of where I want to stop moving." She did not respond immediately. They walked another 30 yards along the creek bank, and a great blue heron lifted from the shallows ahead of them and rose into the orange sky with a slow, enormous grace. "That is a significant thing to say to a woman you met a week ago," Dorothy said. "I know it is," Grant said. "I say it not as a promise or a demand. I say it as the truth because you seem like a woman who prefers truth to careful management." She stopped walking and turned to look at him. The last light was very golden on her face, on the loose tendrils of auburn hair at her temples, and her hazel eyes were dark and soft in the long shadow of the cottonwoods. "I do prefer it," she said, "very much." "Then here is more of it," he said. "I have thought about you every waking hour since I arrived in Caldwell. I find that I do not want to leave. And I am asking whether any of this makes sense to you, not because I expect a particular answer, but because I would rather know than not know." She looked at him for what felt like a full minute, though it was probably 15 seconds, and in those seconds his heart was doing something undignified that he was grateful she could not see. "It makes sense to me," she said quietly. "More sense than most things have in a long time." He took a careful breath. "Then I would like your permission to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing." She smiled, and it was different from the earlier smiles, softer and more deliberate, as if she had decided something that she had been uncertain about and the decision had settled something in her. "I am willing," she said, and so Grant Hale stayed in Caldwell. He wrote to Clifton Bower's outfit in San Antonio and resigned his position, which was not an easy letter to write, because Bower had been a fair employer and Grant had been good at the work. But he could see clearly enough that the life he had been living, 3 months on the trail, a few weeks in town, then back on the trail, was not the life he wanted to continue into. He was 28 years old and he had money saved, not a great deal but enough to begin something, and he had begun to understand that what he wanted to begin it with was here. He went to see Sam Breckenridge, who owned the largest ranch in the county, some 12 miles southwest of Caldwell, and asked for work. Breckenridge was a broad, deliberate man of 55 who had built his operation from scratch in the early 70s and had prospered through a combination of good judgment and relentless work. He looked Grant over with the kind of careful appraisal that a good rancher applied to everything, livestock or men, and asked him direct questions about his experience, his skills with cattle and horses, and his intentions in the territory. Grant answered all of them plainly. Breckenridge said, "I hear you have taken an interest in the Covington girl." "I have," Grant said. "Ellis Covington is a good man," Breckenridge said. "Unlucky but good. His daughter is about the most capable young woman in this county, which is saying something because the frontier produces capable women or it breaks them." "She is extraordinary," Grant said simply. Breckenridge looked at him for another moment, then put out his hand. "I will take you on," he said. $40 a month and quarters in the bunkhouse. Work starts Monday." Grant shook his hand. "I am much obliged." He rode back to town, feeling something he did not have a word for in his immediate vocabulary, but which, had he searched for it, was hope. The practical, grounded kind. The kind that is built from specific actions and real possibilities rather than daydream, and which, because it is built of solid things, tends to last. The courtship, as it unfolded over the next months, was conducted in the way of that era and that place, which is to say it was public and proper and full of small, careful gestures that carried enormous weight by virtue of their restraint. He called at the homestead on Sunday afternoons, which was the accepted visiting day, and sat on the porch with Dorothy and her father, talking. He brought small things when he came, a packet of good coffee, a bolt of blue fabric he had seen in the dry goods store and thought she might like, which she did. He escorted her to the church socials and the barn dances that the community organized in the fall, and on the dance floor he discovered 2 things: that he was an indifferent dancer, and that Dorothy was an excellent one, light and certain in her movements, and that she found his indifferent dancing genuinely and affectionately amusing rather than embarrassing. "You have no natural rhythm," she informed him after the 3rd dance at the October harvest gathering in the Brower barn. the whole thing lit with lanterns and smelling of hay and apple cider and the collective warmth of 60 people. "None," he agreed cheerfully. "You are, however, very earnest about it," she said, "which I find charming." "I will cling to that," he said. He held her hand as he walked her back to where her father sat with the other older men, and the warmth of her hand in his was a simple and complete thing. That fall was a good one, the way certain seasons in the West can be when the heat breaks properly, and the sky turns that particular shade of deep October blue, and the cottonwoods go gold along every creek and river. Grant worked hard at the Breckenridge Ranch, long days of honest physical labor, and he was good at it, his years on the trail having given him a thorough and practical understanding of cattle and the land they moved through. And Breckenridge took note of this and began giving him more responsibility, which Grant took on without complaint. On the evenings he was not at the Covington place. He sat in his quarters at the bunkhouse and wrote in the small journal he kept, which was not a diary exactly but a record of thoughts and observations, a habit he had maintained since his Virginia years. He wrote about Dorothy with a specificity that would have surprised anyone who met him in person, for he was not a demonstrative man in public. But in the privacy of that journal, he wrote about the exact shade of her eyes in the afternoon light, the particular way she laughed when something genuinely surprised her, the set of her shoulders when she was thinking hard about something, the way she spoke about her mother, who had died young, with a love that was old and steady and not diminished by time. He was falling in love. He had suspected it almost from the first evening on the porch, but now, 2 months in, he knew it the way you know the turning of a season, not by a single sign but by the accumulation of small, undeniable evidence. Ellis Covington's health improved as the weather cooled. The fever that had plagued him through the summer receded in October, and by November he was on his feet more reliably, though he was slower than he had been and tired more easily. He and Grant had developed a genuine friendship in the way that good men sometimes do across a significant age gap, built on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for plain speaking. Ellis said once on a cool November afternoon when Dorothy was inside preparing supper, "You are going to ask her, aren't you?" Grant looked at him. "Yes," he said. Ellis nodded. "Good," he said. "She deserves a man who will ask her, not arrange things around her, ask her." "That is exactly what I intend to do," Grant said. "I know," Ellis said. "That is why I am telling you it is good." He asked her in December. He had thought about doing it somewhere romantic, though romantic gestures in Caldwell, Kansas in 1878 were somewhat constrained by the practical nature of the frontier. He had considered the creek bank where they had walked in July, but the December cold had made the creek largely ice and the walk miserable. He had considered the church, but that felt formal in a way that did not match them. In the end it happened not in any arranged setting but in the most ordinary moment, which in retrospect seemed exactly right. They were in the kitchen at the homestead. Ellis had gone to bed early, the nights being cold and his energy still limited, and Dorothy was making tea on the cast-iron stove, and Grant was sitting at the kitchen table watching her, and the lamplight was warm on the rough plank walls and the tea smelled good and the whole scene was so quietly, completely right that he felt he might burst if he did not speak. "Dorothy," he said. She turned from the stove, still holding the kettle. "I love you," he said. "I have for a while. I am not going to pretend otherwise, and I am not going to circle around it any longer." He paused. "I want to marry you, not because of any arrangement or debt or obligation. Because you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and I want to spend my life next to you if you will have me." She set the kettle down on the iron plate and she looked at him, and he could see in her face the full range of what she was feeling, which was considerable, and he loved her for not hiding it. "You are not giving my father a horse or promising someone land," she said. "I am asking you," he said. "Only you." She crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and took his face in both her hands and looked at him for a long moment. this man who had ridden in from the Kishom Trail on a July afternoon with dust on his coat and river-stone eyes and an instinct toward decency that had not yet once disappointed her. And she said, "Yes, Grant Hale. Yes." He stood up from the chair and his arms went around her and she was warm and real and solid, and he pressed his face into the curve of her neck for a moment, just a moment, because he needed to feel the realness of it after 5 months of careful and proper and restrained. "All right," he said against her hair. "All right." They told Ellis that night, and he sat up straighter than he had in weeks and shook Grant's hand with both of his own, and his eyes were bright. And Dorothy knelt next to his chair, and he put his arm around her shoulders and said, "Your mother would have been so happy." And Dorothy pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, and Grant looked away to give them that. The wedding was in February of 1879, which was early in the year for an outdoor ceremony, but the winter had been mild, and the church could hold the whole community, which was exactly what happened. Every soul in Caldwell and several from the surrounding ranches came, because the story of what Grant had done in the alley that July afternoon and why he had stayed had traveled the county thoroughly, and people in that era and that place, whatever their other faults, and there were many, understood the weight of a man who acted on principle. Dorothy wore a dress that she and Mrs. Callahan had made together over the preceding month from the blue fabric Grant had brought her in the fall, and she had let her hair down beneath a small wreath of dried wildflowers that a ranch woman named Clara Breckenridge, the ranch owner's wife, had helped her make. She walked up the aisle on her father's arm, and Grant, standing at the front of the church in his best coat, newly brushed and pressed, watched her come toward him and felt the overwhelming simplicity of the moment. This is it. This is the thing. This is where the moving stops. The preacher, Reverend Thomas O'Ford, a lean, decent man who had been in Kansas since before the war, performed the service with a warmth and lack of pretension that suited them. When he asked Grant if he would take Dorothy Covington as his wife, Grant said, "I will." And the conviction in his voice was so plain and so complete that a woman in the second row, whom neither of them knew well, pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. When he asked Dorothy if she would take Grant Hale as her husband, she looked not at the Reverend but at Grant and said, "I will." And the steadiness of her gaze, that clear hazel gaze that had assessed him from the first moment in the alley and found him, over and over again, worthy of her trust, undid him quietly, completely. They signed the church register and walked out into the pale February sunlight as husband and wife, and the community gathered outside, threw rice and called out good wishes, and someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the churchyard despite the cold, and Dorothy danced with her father first, slowly, carefully, and then with Grant, who danced with his characteristic earnest deficiency of rhythm, and she laughed and did not correct him, and everything was right. They moved into a small house that Grant had rented in town for the first months, a 2-room affair on the eastern edge of Caldwell's Main Street that was modest but dry and warm and theirs. Dorothy made it something within the first week, the way she had the knack for, small arrangements that transformed a space from merely functional to inhabited, a piece of cloth at the window, her books on the shelf, the smell of her cooking in the evening. Their first spring together was the spring of 1879, and Grant was still working at the Breckenridge Ranch, which was 12 miles out but manageable, and he was increasingly trusted there, Breckenridge having promoted him to something approaching a foreman's role by March, which came with better wages. Dorothy took in sewing from several of the ranch families in the area, which she did not do from necessity alone, but from a genuine satisfaction in the work and in maintaining her own contribution to their life. They were happy. Not in the uncomplicated way that makes for a simple story, but in the real way, which involves occasional disagreement and compromise and the ongoing negotiation of 2 distinct lives learning to move together, and which, because of all of that, is made of something more durable than the uncomplicated kind. Ellis Covington's health continued to be variable. He had good months and difficult ones, and Dorothy watched over him with a care that was both steadfast and practical, not sentimental in an overwrought way, but simply, reliably present, making sure he ate well and slept enough and took the medicines that the doctor in town prescribed. Grant helped when he could and deferred to Dorothy on all matters regarding her father, recognizing that she knew him and his needs far better than Grant ever could, and that the best support he could offer was to be the steady ground she could rely on. That summer, a matter arose that returned Rupert Gaines briefly to their lives. It had been a year since the incident in the alley, and Grant had not seen Gaines in the interim. But Gaines was a man of considerable land holdings, and a water rights dispute arose between the Breckenridge Ranch and a neighboring property that Gaines had recently acquired. The dispute was the kind that the territory had seen many versions of, common and contentious, and it required a meeting at the Caldwell courthouse with the county surveyor present. Grant attended the meeting as Breckenridge's representative, as the rancher's rheumatism had made the trip to town difficult. Gaines was there across the table, and they looked at each other with the recognition of men who have a history and understand its nature. The meeting was civil. Gaines conducted himself within the bounds of law and business, and the dispute was resolved by the surveyor's measurement in Breckenridge's favor, with a compromise on the water access that both parties signed. At the end of the meeting, Gaines stood and buttoned his coat and looked at Grant briefly. "I hear you married her," he said. "I did," Grant said. Gaines nodded once slowly, not with warmth but without malice either. "She looked like trouble from the beginning," he said, "the kind that would not be managed. You may have saved us both a considerable difficulty." He walked out, and Grant watched him go and felt something settle, not satisfaction exactly, but the closing of a door that had been ajar. He told Dorothy about it that evening, and she listened with her characteristic stillness, and then she said, "I am glad you do not manage me." "God knows I would not try," he said. She smiled. "You would fail spectacularly." "Spectacularly," he agreed. In the autumn of 1879, Dorothy told him she was with child. She told him early one morning before the sun was fully up, sitting on the edge of the bed they shared in the small house, and he was only half awake when she said the words, but they woke him fully and immediately, and he sat up and took her hand and looked at her in the gray pre-dawn light. "Are you happy?" he asked, because he needed to know how she felt before he let himself feel anything else. "Yes," she said. "Very. Good," he said. "So am I." He brought her hand to his mouth and held it there for a moment. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said honestly. "That is sensible," he said. "Being a little frightened of large things is sensible, but I am here, entirely here." She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and they sat like that in the quiet pre-dawn, the house around them small and warm, and the spring ahead of them unknown and full. He told Ellis the next Sunday, and Ellis sat very still for a moment after hearing the news, his hands flat on the arms of his chair, and his face did something complicated that settled into a deep, quiet joy. He said, "A grandchild," as if testing the word, and then he smiled, a smile so full that it changed the whole geography of his weathered face, and he said it again, to no one in particular, "A grandchild." The winter of 1879 into 1880 was harder than the previous one, which the territory often did, tempting you with gentleness, and then returning its full severity. There were 2 weeks in January when the temperature dropped to brutal lows and stayed there, and the wind off the plain was the kind that found every gap in a wall and every weak spot in a coat. Grant cut and hauled firewood on his off days until there was enough stacked on the south wall of the house to outlast anything the season could produce, and he made sure Ellis had an equal supply at the homestead, doing the hauling himself and splitting the wood in the cold, his breath making clouds in the still air. Dorothy, in the later months of her pregnancy, was both more and less manageable than usual, which Grant navigated with careful attention. She was more likely to be suddenly and deeply tired, which she hated, being by nature a person of high and steady energy, and she was occasionally short-tempered in a way that was unlike her normal self. And Grant learned to distinguish between these temporary states and the actual Dorothy, which was not difficult because she was always, ultimately, the actual Dorothy, just sometimes wearing her fatigue more visibly than she preferred. He came home one February evening to find her sitting at the kitchen table with her mending, untouched in front of her and her eyes closed, asleep upright. And he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. This woman who had been given away like property in an alley and who had refused to go, who had extended her hand to a stranger and decided to trust him and had kept on trusting him. And the feeling that moved through him in that moment standing in the cold doorway was so large and complete that he had no word for it that seemed adequate, love being too small a syllable for something this comprehensive. He moved quietly to the stove and built up the fire and put on a pot of soup from the beef and vegetables he had brought from the ranch, and by the time it was ready she had stirred and was awake, and he set a bowl in front of her without making a thing of the sleeping, and she looked at it and then at him with those hazel eyes, soft with fatigue and warm with knowing him. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than the soup. "Always," he said, meaning more than the answer. Their son was born on the 14th of March, 1880, in the house on the east side of Caldwell, with the doctor from town in attendance and Mrs. Callahan assisting, and Dorothy's labor was long and difficult, but she was, as she was in everything, relentless and clear-minded, and when it was over and the doctor placed the child in her arms, she looked at the small face with an expression that Grant, standing at the bedside, had never seen on any human face before and which he understood was entirely new, called into existence by this specific moment. "He has your eyes," she said. Grant looked at his son, who did in fact have gray eyes, though all newborn eyes were gray, and it would be months before the real color announced itself. "He is extraordinary," Grant said, and meant it the way he meant all things plainly. They named him James Ellis Hale, James for Grant's father and Ellis for Dorothy's, and Ellis Covington, when he came the next day and held his grandson for the first time, wept without embarrassment or apology, and Grant stood in the corner of the room feeling the fullness of what had been built from a July afternoon in an alley and $400, and the decision to not ride south. The years that followed were the years of building. Grant worked his way up steadily at the Breckenridge Ranch, his competence and reliability making him, by 1882, the unquestioned foreman, a position that came with significantly better wages and a degree of independence in his work that suited his nature. He had begun, in his off hours, to put money aside with a specific intention, which was land. The Homestead Acts and the land available in the territory were changing, and Grant had watched the land around Caldwell long enough to understand which sections were worth acquiring. He spent his evenings with the county land records and the maps he had bought from the surveyor, and he talked it over with Dorothy, who had both a keen practical mind and no romantic illusions about land, having grown up on the frontier long enough to understand that land was not poetry. It was water and grass and weather and work. "This section," she said one evening, pointing to the map spread on the kitchen table, James asleep in the back room, the lamp between them. "It runs along the creek. That gives you water rights secured, which you said is the first consideration." "It is," he said, "and the price," he told her. She considered. "We can manage it if we are careful through the spring," she said. "Can Breckenridge give you an advance on next quarter's wages?" "He might," Grant said. "He is a fair man." "Ask him," she said. "If we can close the purchase before summer, we can start fencing by fall." He looked at her across the map, this woman who had come west from Missouri as a girl and had learned the language of the land as her primary language, and he thought, not for the first time, that he was profoundly lucky, not in the random way of luck, but in the specific way that comes from having made one good decision in a Caldwell alley and then spent every day after it trying to be worth that decision. Breckenridge gave him the advance without hesitation. "You have been worth 3 times what I pay you," the old rancher said. "Consider the advance earned already." They purchased the land in April of 1882, 160 acres along the creek southeast of town, and it was theirs. The first land Grant had held since the Virginia farm was lost 16 years before, and standing on it the first morning after the papers were signed, with Dorothy beside him in the early spring light and the creek running clear 10 yards to their left and the Kansas sky enormous above them, he felt the ground beneath his boots as something more than ground. "Well," Dorothy said, looking out over the land. "Well," he said. She took his hand. They stood there for a while, not needing to say anything more. Ellis Covington passed in the spring of 1883. His heart, which had been weakening for years, gave out quietly one April night in the homestead where he had lived since 1869, and Dorothy found him in the morning in his chair by the window, as if he had sat down to watch the dawn and simply not returned from it. She did not fall apart. She was not the kind of woman who fell apart, and falling apart was not what Ellis Covington had raised her for. She mourned him deeply and steadily and without drama, the way she did all important things, and Grant was beside her through every part of it, not trying to diminish the grief or rush it, but simply being present within it, which is what you can do for someone in grief if you love them properly. They buried Ellis beside his wife in the small cemetery north of town, and the whole community came, because Ellis Covington had been in Caldwell for 14 years and had been known as a man of fundamental decency, even when fortune had not been kind to him, and people in frontier towns remembered who their neighbors truly were. Afterward at the homestead, with neighbors having brought food and the rooms full of quiet conversation, Dorothy came and stood beside Grant in the kitchen doorway, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him. "He was happy," she said. "These last years. He told me so." "I know," Grant said. "He told me too." She looked up at him. "He approved of you enormously, you know. He would never say so directly because he was not that kind of man, but he showed it in every possible other way." "I know that too," Grant said. "It meant a great deal to me." She pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment, and he held her. And outside the April afternoon was warm and soft, and the Kansas sky was doing its vast and indifferent beauty as it always did. And inside this house, a daughter was mourning her father and being held by the man who loved her and had chosen her with his own free will and his own free heart. And life was exactly what it always is. Sorrow and love so tangled together you could not separate one from the other. They built the ranch house on their land over the summer of 1883. Grant designed it and Dorothy revised the design, which improved it considerably, and they hired 2 carpenters from town and did a large portion of the work themselves, Grant handling the heavier framing work and Dorothy, who had more than a passing knowledge of carpentry from years of homestead maintenance, working alongside him with a precision that impressed the hired carpenters, who were too polite to say so directly, but expressed it in the way they began to defer to her judgment on the interior measurements. The house was larger than the Caldwell rental, 3 rooms proper with a wide covered porch on the south side that caught the afternoon shade, and a kitchen that was Dorothy's particular domain, and which she designed for efficiency in the way of a person who has cooked serious meals in cramped spaces for years and knows exactly what she needs and where. They moved in during September when the wood was dry and the house was well aired, and the first night they slept in it, with James, 3 years old now and speaking in the complete and assertive sentences of a child who has been thoroughly listened to, asleep in his own room, Grant lay in the dark and listened to the quiet of the land around them and felt, for the first time in his life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He said this to Dorothy, who was lying beside him. She said, "I know. I feel it too." "Is that strange?" he asked, "to feel it so clearly?" "I do not think so," she said. "I think most people never feel it, and those who do should not apologize for it." "I am not apologizing," he said. "No," she agreed. "You never really do." He turned to look at her in the darkness. "Dorothy, Grant, "I love you," he said, "more than when I said it in the kitchen 4 years ago, which I would not have thought possible then." She was quiet for a moment. "I love you past any reasonable measurement," she said. "I loved you approximately a week after you rode into Caldwell looking like a man who had been on a trail for 3 months." "I had been on a trail for 3 months," he said. "You smelled of it," she said warmly. He laughed, quietly so as not to wake James, and she laughed too, and they lay in the dark in their house on their land, and the stars over the Kansas plain were as wide and clear as they had always been, and everything was good. By 1884, the Hale Ranch was a going operation. Grant ran 50 head of cattle, managed them with the same thoroughness he had applied to Breckinridge's operation, and had developed a good working relationship with the buyers at the Caldwell Rail Depot, who knew him as a man whose word on the quality of his cattle was reliable. Dorothy maintained the household accounts with meticulous accuracy, invested in 2 milk cows that she managed herself, and began keeping bees for honey, which she sold at the dry goods store, and which proved to be a modest but consistent secondary income that she pursued with the focused satisfaction of someone who has found a thing they are good at and enjoys it. James, now 4, was everywhere on the ranch at once, a bright and fearless child who had inherited his father's steadiness and his mother's sharp attention, and who had already developed an intense relationship with the horses that reminded Grant, sometimes painfully, of his own early attachment to animals on the Virginia farm. Grant spent hours teaching James the proper way to approach a horse, to speak to it, to read its body language, with the patient thoroughness of a man who knows these things matter. In the fall of 1884, Dorothy told him she was with child again. He received this news with the same first question. "Are you happy?" "Exceedingly," she said. Their daughter, Margaret Ellis Hale, was born in the spring of 1885, and she arrived with considerably more efficiency than James had, which Dorothy reported as a personal improvement, and Grant reported as several years added back to his lifespan. Margaret was small and dark-haired, and from the first weeks showed a fixed and opinionated will that everyone who met her recognized immediately and agreed was not going to diminish with time. The family settled into the rhythms of the ranch and the seasons, which in Kansas were never subtle. The winters required preparation and endurance. The springs required hard work from nearly frozen ground to the first green. The summers were hot and long and demanded consistent attention to water and weather. The falls were often gorgeous and always brief. Grant and Dorothy moved through these rhythms together with the easy coordination of two people who have learned each other thoroughly, each understanding without discussion what the other needs and what the other is doing, and how to align with it rather than against it. They were, by any honest measure, genuinely happy, which in the West of the 1880s was neither a guaranteed nor a simple thing, for the frontier was a place of genuine hardship and genuine opportunity in equal measure, and the outcome depended largely on the specific combination of character and circumstance that each person brought to it. Grant brought his considerable competence and his fundamental decency. Dorothy brought her clear intelligence and her unwillingness to be diminished by anything. Together, they brought a love that had been built not from romance alone, but from real regard, the kind that is made of paying attention to another person, taking them seriously, choosing them repeatedly in the ordinary moments that make up most of a life. There was one more significant test, in the summer of 1886. A drought settled over the region that summer, brutal and unrelenting, the kind that the Great Plains occasionally produced to remind settlers that the land was not theirs by any natural right. The creek on the Hale property dropped to a trickle by August. 2 of their cattle died from heat and dehydration, despite everything Grant could do, and the hay crop was thin. Several neighboring operations were in serious difficulty. Grant made the decision, after a long evening's conversation with Dorothy, to drive the remaining 48 head north to the Smoky Hill River country, where a ranch owner he knew had water and grass enough, and had offered to hold other men's cattle through the drought on a cost-sharing arrangement. It was a 10-day drive with 2 hired hands, leaving Dorothy alone on the ranch with James, now 6, and Margaret, a year old. He did not like leaving. "I will be fine," Dorothy said. "The Breckenridges are 12 miles west, and Clara has said they are there for anything. I have the well, which has not failed. I have the garden. I have a Winchester rifle, and I know how to use it." "I know you know," he said. He looked at her for a long moment. 10 days, 10 days, she said, "and the cattle will be safe, and we will not lose the herd to a drought that will eventually break, because droughts always break." "They do," he agreed. "Go," she said. She put both hands on his face, the way she had in the kitchen years ago when she had said yes. "Come back to me. You always come back." He drove north with the cattle and the 2 hands, a young man named Cody Webb and an experienced drover named Pete Marsh, and the drive was hard in the way of all trail drives in bad weather, but manageable. He made it to the Smoky Hill Ranch in 8 days, settled the cattle, and turned around south, and he was back at the ranch gate on the afternoon of the 9th day because he had pushed the pace on the return. Dorothy came off the porch when she heard August's hooves on the lane, with Margaret on her hip and James running ahead of her, and Grant dismounted before August was fully stopped and caught James as the boy launched himself at him. And then Dorothy was there with Margaret, and he put his arm around them all, and the relief of being back, of being exactly here, was simple and complete. The drought broke in September of that year, as droughts in Kansas tend to, in a series of tremendous thunderstorms that rolled in from the southwest and dropped weeks' worth of rain in 3 days, filling the creek and the ponds and turning the brown land green with almost startling speed. Grant brought the cattle back from the Smoky Hill in October, and they came through the experience leaner but healthy, and by the following spring the herd was fully recovered. Breckenridge died in the winter of 1887, at 73, of a heart failure that took him between one breath and the next on a cold January morning. He left his ranch to his son, who was an able man but who was also interested in moving on to other business ventures in Wichita, and who, within 6 months of his father's death, offered Grant the first right of purchase on the Breckenridge land, and the remaining cattle at a price that was fair, and that Grant and Dorothy, reviewing the accounts and the possibilities with the careful attention they brought to all such decisions, determined they could manage over a period of years through the bank in Caldwell and through Breckenridge Jr.'s willingness to carry a portion of the note privately. They purchased the Breckenridge Ranch in the fall of 1887. It was, by any frontier measure, a significant acquisition. The combined Hale and Breckenridge lands made them one of the larger operations in Sumner County, and Grant was clear-eyed about what this meant: more responsibility, more complexity, more staff, more decisions. He hired 4 cowboys on wages, good men he had known from his years in the area, and he oversaw the combined operation with the same thoroughness he had always applied to smaller scale. Dorothy expanded her role proportionally. She maintained the accounts for the whole operation now, an occupation that required significant mathematical skill and organizational capacity, both of which she possessed in abundance, and she managed the household staff they had acquired with the new property, a cook named Beatrice and a general hand named Amos, with a fairness and directness that both of them appreciated. The injustice of Amos's situation was something both Grant and Dorothy were not blind to. Amos was a freed man from Tennessee, one of many black men who had come west after the war seeking something more equitable than what the South offered, and the West, while not innocent of its own prejudices, was in many ways more genuinely meritocratic simply because competence was the currency that mattered most in hard country. Grant paid Amos the same wage he paid his white hands, which was not universal practice, but was the only practice Grant considered acceptable, and Dorothy treated him with the same matter-of-fact respect she extended to everyone in her household. Amos was a skilled hand and a good man, and he stayed with the Hale operation for many years, becoming one of its most valued members. The same directness applied to the two Wichita tribe families who lived adjacent to the Hale land on the eastern boundary. Grant had always maintained respectful relations with the native communities in the area, recognizing that the displacement the frontier expansion had imposed on these peoples was a profound wrong that he could not undo but would not add to. He traded fairly, resolved any boundary questions with full and open conversation, and made clear that his land's boundaries did not mean the water at the creek was unavailable to neighbors in need. By 1890, the Hale Ranch was prospering in the real way, the kind built from 12 years of consistent, honest work, and the family had grown into the life of the community with genuine depth. Grant served on the County Roads Committee and twice on the board of the local school, and Dorothy was deeply involved in the establishment of the public library that Caldwell undertook in 1889, a project she had championed in the community for 3 years, with the persistent and organized determination that characterized all her projects. James, now 10, was becoming a boy of clear and serious character, with a natural authority that settled itself quietly in his interactions with the ranch hands and the animals alike. He helped with the cattle already, real help, and not the performed variety, and he could ride with skill and was learning to manage the books under his mother's instruction, which Dorothy had started because she intended her son to understand that the land required both physical and intellectual labor to sustain it. Margaret, 5, was a different sort of creature entirely, combustible and brilliant and endlessly curious, who had opinions about everything and the vocal capacity to share them fully, and who had already demonstrated a talent for drawing that Dorothy nurtured with the colored pencils she had ordered from a catalog supplier in Wichita. The winter of 1890 brought another pregnancy, and the spring of 1891 brought their third child, a son they named Thomas Grant Hale, a name chosen after a Sunday afternoon of considerable discussion that ended with both of them agreeing it was exactly right. Thomas arrived healthy and loud and with a tuft of auburn hair that was clearly Dorothy's contribution, and James, 11, took one look at his new brother and immediately appointed himself the boy's primary protector, a role he maintained from that day forward. Dorothy recovered well and quickly, because she was constitutionally opposed to being unwell any longer than strictly necessary, and by summer she was as fully present as always, which Thomas, from his vantage point on her hip, seemed to find ideal. In the autumn of 1892, Grant rode into Caldwell on a Wednesday for supplies, and stopped outside the dry goods store to look at the town he had ridden into 14 years before on a July afternoon with dust on his coat and 40 head of cattle, and a plan that had dissolved before nightfall. The town was larger now, more settled, the raw frontier quality of 1878 having given way to something more established, storefronts with glass windows, a proper school building, a second church, a telegraph office that had been there since '85. The Red Spur Saloon was still there, though under new ownership, and the livery stable where he had put August that first afternoon was still operating, run now by the original keeper's son. He sat on August, who was 12 years old now and gray around the muzzle but still sound, and he looked at the street and felt the full weight of the 14 years between this afternoon and that one, not as heaviness but as substance, the way stone is heavier than wood because it is more real. He had ridden in with 40 head of cattle and a soul worn thin, and a plan to rest for one night and head south. He had not headed south. He had walked into an alley and seen a woman being handed off like property, and something in him had refused to look away, and from that refusal, from that single instinct toward decency, all of it had come. The $400, the porch conversation, the courtship, the December kitchen, the blue dress at the church in February, the land along the creek, the house with the porch that caught the afternoon shade, the children, the life. He sat on his old horse in the October sunshine and thought, with a completeness and clarity that he rarely allowed himself, because he was not by nature a sentimental man in public ways, that he was the luckiest man he knew. He bought the supplies and rode home. Dorothy was on the porch when he came up the lane, as she often was in the afternoon when the day's main work was done, and she lifted a hand when she saw him coming, and the gesture was so familiar and so full of ease that it struck him as the most beautiful thing he had seen all day, which was saying something, because the October Kansas sky had been putting on a considerable performance. He tied August at the rail and came up the porch steps, and she looked at him with those eyes that he had been looking into for 14 years and that still, every time, gave him the sense of seeing something complete. "You look like a man who has been thinking," she said. "I have been," he said. He sat in the chair beside her. About July of 1878, he said. She was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I was thinking," he said, "about what a single afternoon can determine. One afternoon, one alley, one decision to not ride past." She looked out at the land, their land, and the creek in the middle distance and the cattle moving slowly in the afternoon light, and she said, "I think about it sometimes too." "Do you?" "I think about what would have happened if you had not stopped," she said. "I was going to hold my ground with Gaines as long as I could. But he was a man who had the law on his side, technically, and my father's word behind him, and I was one woman with no money and no legal standing." She paused. "I do not know what would have happened ultimately. I prefer not to." "I prefer not to either," Grant said. She reached over and took his hand, the way she had been taking his hand for 14 years, and her hand was warm and familiar and specific, the calluses from her work and the ring on her finger that he had put there on a February morning in the Caldwell church. "It was a good decision," she said, "walking into that alley. The best of my life," he said. "Well," she said, with a small smile, "it led to most of what I would consider the best of mine." They sat together on the porch as the October afternoon deepened toward evening, and the light went gold and long across the land, and from inside the house came the sound of Margaret's voice, bright and assertive as always, instructing Thomas in something, and the deeper, patient sound of James redirecting both of them, and the whole domestic texture of the life they had built was present in that sound, and in the warmth of her hand in his, and in the way the land lay quiet and theirs in the fading light. Grant looked at his wife in the October gold and thought that there were no sufficient words for what he felt, which was a thing he had thought before, and he had learned not to apologize for the insufficiency of language, but simply to express what he could when he could. "I love you, Dorothy Hale," he said. She turned to look at him, and her eyes in the late light were both colors at once, green and gold, which was the trick they did in certain light, and which still, after 14 years, was his favorite thing about an afternoon. "I love you, Grant Hale," she said. "I have loved you since an afternoon in July when you walked into an alley as a stranger and called a bad thing by its exact name, and handed over $400 you had earned with 3 months of honest work without asking me for a single thing in return. I asked you something eventually," he said. "You asked me," she said. "That was the point. You asked me." She squeezed his hand. "That has always been the point." The evening came in slowly, as October evenings on the Kansas plain have a way of doing, the sky turning from gold to rose to the deep blue-purple of early dark, and the first stars appearing in the east while the western horizon still held a thin line of amber light. The windmill turned slowly in the evening breeze, and the cattle settled in the pasture, and somewhere on the property, a meadowlark was singing, late in the season for it but insistent, as if it had something that needed to be said. James came to the porch doorway and said that supper was ready, because at 12 he had taken to helping Beatrice in the kitchen on evenings when both his parents were on the porch, a habit that made Dorothy's heart full every time she registered it. They went inside, all 5 of them, into the warm lamplit kitchen where Beatrice had made beef stew and fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that Thomas regarded from his chair with the focused intensity of a very young person who has decided his priorities clearly. They ate together at the long table in the kitchen, the family Grant had built from a July afternoon and a clear debt and an offered hand. And the conversation was as it always was, overlapping and warm and full of the specific texture of people who know each other completely. And the lamp burned steady, and the stew was good, and outside the Kansas night was wide and cold and full of stars. After supper, when the children were in bed and Beatrice had gone to her quarters, Grant washed the last of the dishes while Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with the accounts ledger, making notes for the next quarter's planning. And the domestic quiet around them was the kind that is only possible between people who have spent years together without losing interest in each other. He dried his hands on the cloth by the basin and turned to look at her, bent over the ledger with her pen moving precisely across the page, and the lamplight on her auburn hair, which she wore loose in the evenings, now threaded with the first silver that had begun to appear in the last year or two, and which he had told her, entirely beautiful, which she had received with a raised eyebrow and then a genuine pleasure. "Come to bed," he said. She looked up and smiled. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. "I want to finish this entry." 10 minutes, he said. He went to check on the children, which was his evening custom. James was asleep with the ease of a boy who had spent the day in genuine physical and mental effort. Margaret was not asleep. She was rarely asleep when she was supposed to be, but she was lying quietly in the dark with her eyes open and thinking about something. And when Grant looked in, she said, "Papa, why do stars burn?" "That," he said, "is a question for tomorrow because it has a long answer." "Tell me the beginning of it," she said. He told her a version of what he knew, which was limited, and she listened with the sharp attention she always paid to information. And by the time he reached the edge of his knowledge on the subject, she was, finally, asleep, her cheek against the pillow and her dark hair spread around her on the white cotton. He checked Thomas, who was deeply asleep with an expression of total contentment, and stood there for a moment looking at this small person, his third child, with the same sense of foundational wonder that he had felt looking at James and looking at Margaret. Then he went to the bedroom, and Dorothy was already there, the lamp turned low, and she was sitting on the edge of the bed reading, as she often did for a few minutes before sleep. He sat beside her, and she closed the book and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her. "Good day," she said. "Good day," he said. "Good life." She tilted her head back to look at him. "Yes," she said simply. "Good life." He kissed her, which he did not need a reason for, and she kissed him back, which she never needed a reason for either. And the lamp burned low, and the Kansas night was still and full, and the stars over the plain were the same stars that had always been there, the same ones they had sat under on the porch in the summer of 1878, when they had been strangers becoming something more, and would be under for all the years ahead, which stretched before them open and possible and full of the specific, irreplaceable texture of a life made of love and choice, and the refusal to look away. Grant Hale had ridden into Caldwell on a July afternoon with nothing planned beyond a night's rest and a southward road. He had been handed a woman's future in an alley like a deed to unwanted land, a future arranged by other men in other rooms for reasons that had nothing to do with what that woman was or what she deserved. He had voided the deal. He had torn up the deed. He had extended his own hand freely, with nothing asked in return, and she had taken it freely with everything offered in return. And from that exchange, that simple and radical act of one person treating another as fully themselves and fully worthy of their own life, everything else had come. The land and the house and the cattle and the children and the years of ordinary and extraordinary days stacked one upon another into something that was, when you looked at it whole, astonishing in its completeness. That was what love made when it was built right. Not a monument or a drama, though it had had its moments of both, but a life, a real and full and specific and wholly their own life. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.